Chesterton's fence. Have you ever heard of it? Me either. And yet, it is the cause of more change programs going wrong than you could possibly imagine. Caroline Webb, my guest, is hugely experienced and wise in the world of change. She has been part of many, many change projects. So we get into it and we talk about the thing you should be doing before you do anything, why we are addicted to adding and terrified of subtraction, and that damn fence. This is a great conversation. I'm Michael Bungay-Stenya. This is Change Signal. This is the podcast where we cut through the blather and the BS and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change management. Now, before we plunge in further, just to say, you should definitely expect a full-length conversation every couple of weeks. That is the Change Signal schedule. But this is a conversation about change. So we can't be too predictable. That would be wrong. So every now and then, I'll be slipping in a bonus episode. This is the first of these, and I think you're going to love it. Here's why. One of the things I'm really aware of in this podcast, a goal for this podcast, is to be closing the gap between theory and practice. I mean, you know, there's that famous quote from Yogi Berra. He's an American baseball player. And Yogi Berra said, well, he said a bunch of great things, but one of the quotes I love about his is, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they're not. So this gap I'm looking to close, or at least I want to have theory and practice jiving on the same dance floor. So as well as talking to people who have had great ideas, the people who write books, and as well as talking to people who actually hold change leader roles in big organizations, I want to be talking to those people I know who I think are great guides and great consultants and great mentors. They have great experience and they have great practicality. These are people who have calluses on their hands and they have dirt under their fingernails. One of the very smartest and most experienced and most eloquent people I know in this space is Caroline Webb. So Caroline, welcome.
Hello, it's wonderful to be here.
I first got to know you through your excellent book, How to Have a Good Day. It's a book that uses behavioral science to point to how to live and how to work well. But as I've become friends with you, I've come to realize that that is not really the heart of your work. So how do you introduce yourself?
Well, I wear a few different hats, but my day job is leadership coaching. So I work with a lot of people who are trying to drive change in their organizations. And I'm an author. I write about how to use behavioral science to do all of that better, to be a better leader, to be a better change driver.
And how did you get to who you are today?
Well, I had a first career as an economist and then a second career as a management consultant where I did a lot of change management work. I was fascinated in what it took to make organizations and teams more effective. And that was really the focus of my time. I was at McKinsey, the consulting firm, for 12 years. And that was where I honed my craft of helping leaders make change happen.
That's fantastic. So Caroline, in one of the first interviews I did for the Change Signal podcast, it was the conversation with Lydie Klotz around subtraction. And because I was just starting out, I sent it to you and I said, I'd love feedback. I'm just at the start of this journey. I'm trying to serve people who lead change in organizations. So what do you think? How could I make this conversation feel better and more useful and more elegant? And you came back to me with some really great ideas, particularly around the heart of the challenge, the theory practice challenge, which is like, okay, how do you do this? And this felt very real for the conversation with Lydie, because I personally think subtraction is this massively underestimated, significant idea in change and transformation. But I'm also really aware it's an idea that is it becomes abstract. It can feel a bit elusive. Everybody can get a bit jazz hands around it. So I wanted to have a conversation with a practitioner, an experienced practitioner like you on this. How do I stop and how do I remove and how do I cut and how do I subtract? So Caroline, I'm hoping you can help me. Where do we start? How would you go about helping people to stop doing stuff and bring this idea of subtraction into the work that they're doing?
You have to do quite a bit of data gathering and be a little open-minded right from the beginning and say, okay, well, there's probably stuff we've forgotten that we're committed to.
Right.
And we have to really get a grip on, what is going on. we have something called emission bias. So we tend to look at the pros and cons of doing something. We don't tend to look at the pros and cons of doing nothing.
Right.
Our brain is trying to keep things simple and quiet. And the unexamined life is less tiring. There's no doubt.
That's great.
But it's an important place to start, because if you just add new things, then everybody's just going to get burned out, right? I mean, we all have limited time in the day.
Yeah.
So I always, when I'm talking to a leader about doing something new, I always talk about, well, what are you going to stop to create space for that? Sometimes that's their own calendar. Sometimes that's what's going on in the organization. But the challenge is pretty often that people don't even know what's going on right now. And that even starts with their calendar. And it certainly starts with, projects, initiatives, task forces across the organization. So if you're trying to stop stuff to create space for something that's more valuable, you can't just take a machete and wave it around your head. You actually have to know what is there that's actually going on right now.
As I hear Caroline say this, I'm thinking to myself, oh yeah, of course, physician, heal thyself. And for me, the insight is that, look, if I want to practice subtraction at an organizational change level, and I do, well, I can glean insights and practice first at an individual self-management level. Do you have any insight around how people can become more aware of the invisible or unconscious commitments that they have? Because so much of that stuff just lurks below the surface. You don't even realize that that's what's part of what's filling your cup.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it takes a systematic approach. So, when I'm working with a leader and I'm trying to encourage them to think about, well, what is actually going on in your organization right now? You've got to get out there and make lists. And, it actually can be really helpful to do it in a physical way, get people to write the initiatives on, sticky notes and organize them and actually map out what's going on. There was one time I was doing that with a hospital CEO and their team. And they were excited about a new change program. And we were trying to get them really focused on 3 big themes of work in support of the big change goal.
Right.
And trying to figure out, well, how does what the organization is doing right now map to those 3 themes? And then it started to come out that people started mentioning, oh, well, there's this initiative on patient safety in the cardiac pathway. And, oh, I thought that was finished. Is that not finished? I thought that was done. And then, this kept on going around the room and people were making comments about projects that others thought were done, others that no one had ever heard of. And then when people tried to actually say, well, where are we at with those? Actually, there was a lack of information. So sometimes if you've got a central project manager, you can pull this together quite easily. But a lot of the time you've got to be systematic, ask everybody, get it written down, mapped out. And, then you start to get a picture that you can work with. How
do people resist this work?
Well, go back to your calendar, right? Sometimes you don't really want to confront.
I know. I don't want to look. I mean, I'm already kind of shrinking in my seat. I'm afraid you're going to make me look at my actual calendar, which would be horrible.
There you go. You don't actually want to confront sometimes the way that you're wasting time.
Yeah.
And the same goes for organizations. You don't want to confront the way that you're wasting energy and resources. But also, honestly, it's nothing, nefarious. It's nothing bad. A lot of the time, it's just, status quo bias. We're going to carry on with what we did before. And most of what we do is on autopilot.
I really want you to hear what Caroline just said, because this is such an important and powerful phrase and idea, the status quo bias. This is language I think as a change leader you should bring into your conversations, because we just underestimate how much you, me, your leaders, your organizations, how much we love things to be exactly the way they are. Even as we talk about wanting to change them, even as if we're stressed by the way things are right now, we are fundamentally attuned to the way things are, homeostasis. And to shift the status quo, it's really helpful to better audit it and to understand it, just as Caroline has suggested. Now, I'm going to come back to this whole idea of the power of the status quo later on in this interview. Caroline, do you have how would you coach me on closing down or stopping? If we've done an audit and I'm like, man, there's a lot going on. I mean, at a personal level for sure, but even at an organizational level, if you're working with a senior leader, how do you coach them into going, how do we stop this? How do we actually wrap this up? How do we shut it down?
Well, I try to get to what they're uniquely able to do. I talk about uniqueness a lot. There's this concept in economics which dates from the 1700s called comparative advantage. In the early work on this, it was country levels. Countries should be focusing on areas where they're best at producing stuff. Well, that's sort of obvious. But what if a country is best at producing everything? What if a leader is better at everything than their team?
Right.
Should they do everything? No, they can't.
Yeah.
We're time constrained, we're resource constrained. So you've got to focus on the things where the gap between what you can do and others can do is biggest. Right?
Yeah.
So you cannot do everything that you're best at. You can only do the things that you're really much, much better than other people at.
Right.
So when you're thinking about a leader, there's a bunch of stuff that really only they can do. Only they can do the, inspiring communication to the audience and across the organization. Only they can do the big picture strategic thinking.
Yeah.
Someone else can do some of the operational stuff that maybe they used to be good at.
And how do you guide one of your senior leaders through the process of giving up some of that control and some of that certainty?
I help them see the cost of not doing it. Because the cost of not giving up some of the stuff that's currently on their plate is that usually there's really important stuff that only they can do that is not being done. And, just taking strategy and operations as a kind of very oversimplified kind of pair of headings.
Yeah.
If you are unable to let go of operational excellence, important though that is, then nobody else is doing the strategy. And then what are you doing the operational excellence in service of? And so, it's often, I would say every leader I work with goes through this phase of resistance about not wanting to let go of things they used to be amazing at.
Yeah.
Because it's our sense of comfort again, right?
That's right. Yeah. I want to jump in and give you some language around this before we carry on with the conversation with Caroline. I read a book a couple of years ago called How to Begin. And one of the core concepts in that book is this: every choice you make has prizes and punishments. Pros and cons, you can say that. I like prizes and punishments. It makes it a richer conversation. And when I say every choice, I mean every choice, including the choice of not changing something. And there's this discipline when you look at your two choices. Do we change this? Do we not change it? And you weigh up the costs. You weigh up the pros and cons. You weigh up the prizes and punishments. And that's a exacting and powerful exercise. Caroline, I know in the email exchange that we had, you talked about the power of this audit. And I think that is already such a helpful tool for people listening in going, look, actually, let's figure out what's already going on here before we launch this next thing. I remember working for a bank here in Canada, and they're like, we're very excited to bring your coaching program in. And we're like, we're very excited as well. And then we did a bit of an audit, probably not as rigorously as we could. And we're like, oh, there are currently 16 other coaching models and programs floating around this bank right now. So we have to figure out how our thing coexists or removes or does something with all those other things. And we actually needed to address that to help the coaching program actually get sticky and feel useful for people, rather than, why am I learning a seventh approach to how I think about coaching in my organization?
Absolutely. And I remember one time when I was trying to come up with a new framework for thinking about executive team effectiveness. And I realized there was a framework that was sort of adjacent. It was to do with organizational effectiveness. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if I just sort of simplified a bit and thought whether I could dovetail these together rather than inventing something completely new? So I think it's a great thing to do, to kind of do the audit and then say, could I work with the grain of what exists already where I can?
Yeah.
That is a really smart thing to do.
Change at an organizational level often fails.
In that email we went back and forth on, you talked about the audit. You also talked about Chesterton's fence. I didn't know this phrase. So what is this?
Well, G.K. Chesterton was one of these Renaissance folks in the late 1800s and early 1900s who, had a lot of talents. One of them was philosophy. And he wrote about the problem of coming across a fence. And he said, a newfangled, modern change leader will look at this and say, oh, well, this is obviously, this has been here for ages. It can't, there's no obvious use for it. We should get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, a more enlightened change leader comes up and says, okay, we don't know why this is here. If this is here, it's here for a reason.
Right.
Until we know why it's here, we must not get rid of it. And so that's what Chesterton's fence is, which is essentially do not remove a fence until you know why it was put there in the first place.
I love that.
So, I think when you're eagerly doing your audit and you're eagerly thinking what can you take away, just, the audit doesn't just include listing stuff out. I mean, it also includes understanding why stuff is there.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm taking from this, Caroline, is, first of all, you probably don't know what's already happening. Secondly, you're probably not as aware as you think you are about how overcommitted people already are. And therefore, what is their capacity for change at whatever scale you're playing at that? Thirdly, I'm being reminded of just how comfortable and familiar status quo is. We underestimate the gravity of the status quo because we, even though we might be stressed and kind of overwhelmed by stuff, it's a familiar stress and it's a familiar overwhelm. And then fourthly, and this kind of combines Chesterton fence and the audit, part of what I'm taking away from this is you don't just do an audit so you can cut stuff. You do an audit to understand what's going on because A, it might become apparent what you can stop doing, really powerful. But B, it might be apparent what you don't need to do because it already exists or exists partially. So in a more efficient, more elegant way, you can actually get some stuff done by surfing a wave that's already there rather than feeling like you have to paddle out and find a brand new wave.
So true. I thought that's beautiful. That summary, just gold.
Caroline, it's a pleasure as always. For people who want to know more about you and your work, where do they find you in the world?
I'm at carolinewebb.co, and there you can learn about what I write about and the kind of coaching that I do. Come on over.
Tell me again about the name of the book you've written.
The name of the book I've written is How to Have a Good Day, which is showing people how to use insights from behavioral science in a really accessible, easy way to improve your performance and well-being at work. And the one that I'm writing is doing the same for leadership. And title is sort of still being workshopped, but that's in the hopper. So if you're interested in leadership, that's coming down the pipe.
I can't wait. I know. I'm a big fan of How to Have a Good Day. That's how we met, in fact, years ago. Me interviewing about that book. So I'm eagerly awaiting the new book, Caroline. Crack on with it, please.
I'm writing as fast as I can.
Yeah. You shouldn't be doing podcasts like this with me. You should be turning people like me down.
Make an exception for my dearest friends.
Oh, thank you, Caroline. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure too.
The message I get from this conversation, from this podcast, is we always have choices. So it is so powerful to surface those choices, to know what those choices are, and to know that every choice has prizes and punishments. Now, one of the choices you have right now is to love up the Change Signal podcast. So thank you if you're making that choice. I'd certainly be grateful. Give it some stars, give it a review on your podcast platform of choice. That's always marvelous. But perhaps even more valuable for me would be if you reached out to another change leader, somebody on your C-suite, somebody on your team, somebody you know in another organization, and tell them that you love the podcast. Maybe send them this particular episode. We're here to cut through the blather and the BS and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change management. I'm glad you're here with us. Thanks for coming along.